A routine follow-up becomes a fault line. A man learns his time is short just as the life he built begins to slip from his hands. Determined to keep one last ordinary evening, he returns to a wife growing distant. And a confession that redraws every goodbye he imagined. What do you hold on to when truth arrives twice in one day? When I first walked into the doctor's office that morning, I had no reason to believe my life was about to split neatly into a before and an after. It was one of those gray mornings when the light outside feels weak and tired, as though the sky itself had already given up on the day. I had gone in for what I thought would be a routine follow-up on some breathing trouble that had started as a mild cough weeks earlier and refused to go away. The waiting room was filled with the soft sound of magazines being turned and the distant hum of a vending machine, and I remember thinking about how ordinary it all felt. There was no sign that in a few short minutes I would hear words that would make everything I once cared about lose its shape. When the doctor called me in, he looked like someone who had spent too many years delivering bad news. He spoke slowly, carefully, almost as if he was afraid that saying the words too quickly would make them hurt more. He told me the scans had confirmed the presence of advanced cancer in my lungs and that it had already spread far beyond the point of easy treatment. For a while I just sat there looking at the pattern on the carpet that swirled in uneven circles while my mind tried to find something else to hold on to. I think I even nodded like someone pretending to understand directions in a foreign language. The doctor kept speaking about treatment plans, about timelines, about comfort measures, but the only thing that stayed with me was the phrase "not much time." After I left the clinic, the air outside felt different, heavier somehow, as if the world had shifted slightly out of balance. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel for what must have been an hour, though it felt longer. I thought about my wife Anna and how I would tell her. We had been married for 8 years, and even with the usual ups and downs, I always believed we were solid. She was the kind of woman who filled every room with warmth, and yet lately that warmth had begun to fade. There had been nights when she came home late from work claiming she had to finish reports, and I had believed her because trust had always been the backbone of what we shared. At least that was what I thought then. I decided not to tell her right away. Part of it was fear, and part of it was a strange need to keep the truth contained a little longer before it changed everything. I wanted one more evening where things felt normal. That night I made dinner, the same pasta she always liked, and waited for her to come home. She arrived nearly 2 hours later, looking distracted, her phone lighting up with messages she did not read in front of me. I told her about the day in vague terms, said that the doctor wanted to run more tests and that it might be something minor. She touched my shoulder briefly, said she was sure it was nothing, and then spent the rest of the evening scrolling through her phone with a small smile she tried to hide. After she went to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen staring at the reflection of the ceiling light on the table. The reality of the diagnosis pressed down on me like a weight I could not lift. I kept thinking about how time had suddenly become something measurable, not by years but by weeks and months. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, and every sound felt amplified, as if the house itself was aware of what I had learned. I remember looking at our wedding photo on the wall and trying to connect that image of two people beaming with certainty to the quiet distance that now filled our home. It felt almost absurd that life could unravel this quietly without any dramatic music or thunder, just a silent, slow fading of everything that once seemed permanent. I wanted to believe that Anna's distraction was nothing more than stress, that work had consumed her attention, that the smile she hid at her phone was harmless. But a small voice deep inside whispered something different, something I did not want to name. Before going to bed, I wrote a few words in my notebook, the one I used to keep track of errands and grocery lists. I wrote, "Today the doctor told me I am dying." Then I closed it and placed it in the drawer. The words looked strange on paper, like they belonged to someone else. I lay in bed beside Anna, who was already asleep, breathing softly, her face turned away from me, and I listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing. I wondered if she could sense how far away I felt from everything we had built. Sleep never came easily that night. I kept thinking about how I would tell her when I finally found the courage. I imagined the conversation over and over in my head, but every version ended with her crying in my arms, telling me we would face it together. I clung to that imagined version of her, the one I thought I knew, the one who loved me beyond question. I did not yet understand that there was another story waiting beneath the surface, one that would make the diagnosis feel almost like the lesser tragedy. By dawn, I had already decided that tomorrow I would tell her the truth. It felt like the right thing to do, the brave thing. I had no idea that by the time I finally opened my mouth to speak, the world would once again shift in a way I could never have prepared for. The morning I planned to tell Anna about my diagnosis began quietly with the same kind of soft gray light that had followed me since that doctor visit, as though the sky had taken on the mood of my thoughts. I brewed coffee and sat at the table waiting for her to come down the stairs. She had already left before I woke up, which was unusual since we often shared breakfast even on her busiest days. She left a short note saying she had an early meeting and would see me in the evening. I stared at the note for a long time, wondering why her handwriting looked hurried, as if she had written it while standing by the door. I spent the rest of the morning walking around the house in slow circles, noticing details I had ignored before: the uneven paint on the hallway wall, the sound of the floorboards beneath my feet, the faint smell of the flowers she had placed on the windowsill weeks ago that were now starting to wilt. Everything felt sharper now, as if my senses were trying to record the world before it slipped away from me. I thought about calling my parents, about telling my sister, about sending an email to my boss, but each thought dissolved under the same weight of exhaustion. The only person I wanted to talk to was Anna, because somehow telling her first felt like an acknowledgement that I was still part of something that mattered. By late afternoon, the silence in the house had become unbearable, so I decided to drive to the small park near the river where Anna and I used to walk when we first moved here. The air smelled like rain and the trees swayed gently as if whispering secrets to one another. I sat on a bench watching the water ripple and tried to imagine what life would look like for her after I was gone. Would she stay in this house, or would she sell it and move somewhere new where the walls did not remember me? I wanted to believe she would keep a piece of me somewhere: a photograph, a shirt, the smell of my aftershave clinging to an old scarf. Those small remnants of love we leave behind without realizing how temporary they are. When I returned home that evening, Anna was already there, her shoes kicked off near the door, her jacket draped carelessly over a chair. She was standing by the sink, looking out the window, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was soft, but her tone was lighter than I had heard in weeks, and she was laughing in that way people laugh when they forget someone else is nearby. When she noticed me, she quickly ended the call, saying she would talk later. For a moment I almost asked who it was, but something inside me told me to hold back. Instead I said I had something important to talk about, and she nodded, though her eyes looked tired. She sat across from me at the table, and for the first time in days I felt my chest tighten with something close to panic. I began to speak, but before I could finish my first sentence, she covered her face with her hands and started crying. The suddenness of it startled me. Her shoulders trembled and her breath came in uneven bursts, as if she had been holding back this storm for a long time. I reached out instinctively, thinking she must have somehow sensed what I was about to say, but before I could touch her, she said something that made my entire world tilt again. She whispered that she had done something terrible, something she could not undo, and that she needed to tell me before it was too late. I sat frozen, my half-formed words about cancer stuck in my throat. She told me she had been seeing someone else. The words came out broken, as though she hated their shape but could not stop them from spilling out. She said it had started months ago when she was traveling for work, that she had felt lonely and lost, and one mistake had turned into many. I remember hearing the words but not really understanding them at first. Felt like listening to a story about strangers. Then she said she was pregnant. That was the moment everything inside me seemed to go quiet. The sound of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the street outside all faded until there was only the echo of her confession hanging in the air. She kept talking, saying she had not meant for it to happen, that she still cared for me, that she was ashamed. I barely heard her. My mind kept replaying the irony of it all, how I had spent the day rehearsing how to tell her I was dying, while she was preparing to tell me she had already replaced the life we were supposed to share. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, though no sound came out. I just sat there staring at the small crack in the wall behind her, trying to focus on anything else. When she finally stopped speaking, she looked at me, waiting for me to respond, but I had nothing left to give. My mouth was dry and my chest felt hollow. I wanted to scream, to ask how long, to demand why, but the questions felt useless now. She was still the woman I had planned to lean on through my final months, yet in a single evening, she had become a stranger, sitting across the table with red eyes and trembling hands. I stood up quietly, walked to the living room, and sank into the couch. She followed me, asking if I would say something, anything, but I couldn't. I just looked at the dark screen of the television that reflected both of us like two blurred figures caught in the same frame but living separate lives. Eventually she stopped asking and went upstairs, leaving me alone with the silence that felt heavier than the disease itself. That night I did not sleep. I lay awake listening to the faint sound of water running in the bathroom and thought about how quickly love can dissolve without anyone noticing until it is already gone. I had gone into the day believing that my illness was the cruel twist of fate that would change everything, but now it felt like something even deeper had died long before I ever got the diagnosis. When dawn came again, I realized I had no tears left. I got up from the bed, quietly careful not to wake her, and wrote another line in my notebook beneath the first entry. This time I wrote, "Today I learned that dying is not always the worst thing that can happen." I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, knowing that the hardest part was still to come because I had yet to decide whether I would tell her about my cancer at all. For the next few days I lived inside a kind of fog that dulled everything around me. The world kept moving, the sun kept rising and setting, the traffic outside our window carried on its endless rhythm, yet none of it felt real. Each morning I woke up beside Anna, pretending to still be the husband she once loved, while inside I felt like a ghost quietly haunting my own life. She tried to act normal after that confession, going about her routines, tidying the kitchen, answering work calls, as if nothing monumental had happened. I could tell she was waiting for me to bring it up, to start the conversation. She didn't have the courage to restart, but I stayed silent because I had no words that would make sense of any of it. In those quiet hours I began to notice the small things that had escaped me before. Her new perfume that wasn't one she owned before, the way her phone was always on silent when she came home, the careful distance she kept when she walked past me in the hallway. Every detail felt like a thread I could pull until the whole picture of our life unraveled. I realized that while I had been counting the weeks since my diagnosis, she had been counting the days since her affair began. It was strange how two people could share the same roof yet live inside entirely different stories. I started spending more time outside, just driving aimlessly through town because being home felt unbearable. The doctors had given me pamphlets and numbers to call for support groups, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out. I didn't want sympathy, not from strangers and certainly not from Anna. The idea of telling her now about the cancer felt absurd, almost cruel. She had already moved on emotionally, maybe even physically, to another life that did not include me. What good would it do to hand her another piece of tragedy she didn't ask for? I imagined her reaction, the tears, the guilt, the apologies, and I knew I couldn't stand to see her pity. I wanted to leave her with the version of me she already saw, the one quietly fading from her life, rather than the dying man she might try to save out of obligation. On the third night after her confession, she came to me while I was sitting on the porch staring at the dark sky. She said she was sorry again and that she didn't know what she wanted anymore. I listened without interrupting. She said the man she had been seeing was not part of her future, that she was confused and afraid, that she didn't plan to hurt me. I wanted to believe her, but the words landed hollow. She asked if I hated her, and I said no, which was true in a way. Hate would have required more energy than I had left. What I felt was closer to emptiness, a quiet ache that had replaced every other emotion. She reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away gently, pretending it was because I was cold. The truth was I didn't want her comfort. Felt misplaced now. Later that night, after she went to bed, I sat in the living room and opened my laptop. I started writing letters to the people who mattered to me, my parents, my sister, an old friend from college I hadn't spoken to in years. I wrote about memories, not goodbyes, because I didn't want them to remember me as someone who had already surrendered. I wanted them to think of the laughter, the shared meals, the easy moments when life had felt endless. When I finished the letters, I sealed them in envelopes and placed them in a box in my desk drawer next to the notebook that held the truth Anna still didn't know. The next morning, I decided to visit my parents. They lived 2 hours away in a quiet neighborhood where the houses all looked like they were built from the same blueprint. The drive was peaceful, the road lined with fields that shimmered in the early light. I didn't tell them why I was really there, I just said I missed them. My mother hugged me tightly and my father asked if everything was all right, and I smiled in that practiced way that hides more than it reveals. We sat on the porch drinking tea while my father talked about the garden he was planting for spring, and I tried to memorize every sound of that moment, the birds, the wind, the way my mother laughed softly at his stories. I wanted to hold on to it because I knew these were the fragments of life I would miss most. When I returned home that evening, the house was dark except for the faint glow from the kitchen. Anna was sitting at the table, her face illuminated by the light from her phone. She looked up quickly when I entered, as if she had been caught doing something she shouldn't. She told me she had made dinner and that she wanted to talk. I sat down across from her and waited. She said she had been thinking about everything and that she wanted to make things right. She didn't know how, but she wanted to try. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, or maybe it was just guilt. She said she wanted to tell me everything about the man, about how it happened and why. I told her it wasn't necessary. The details didn't matter anymore. What was broken couldn't be explained back into place. Still, she began to talk, and I listened quietly, as she described how lonely she had felt, how work trips had turned into excuses, how one evening had changed everything. Her voice trembled when she said she didn't expect to get pregnant, and that she hadn't even decided what she was going to do about it. She asked what I thought she should do, and I told her it wasn't my decision. That was the last thing I said before leaving the room. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked away, but I didn't turn around. That night I dreamed of water, endless water stretching out under a gray sky, and I was swimming toward a shore that kept drifting farther away no matter how hard I tried. When I woke the next morning, the dream stayed with me, lingering like fog. I realized that the conversation with Anna hadn't changed anything. The distance between us was permanent, now carved into place by everything left unsaid. I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my teeth and looking at the face that stared back. The hollow eyes, the skin pale from sleepless nights, the faint tremor in my hands. I knew I was running out of time, not just because of the cancer, but because I couldn't live like this anymore, suspended between what had been and what could never be again. That was the moment I decided to leave. Not forever, at least not yet, but long enough to breathe air that didn't carry her scent, long enough to remember who I was before all of this began. I didn't know where I would go, only that I had to start moving before the stillness swallowed me whole. When I finally left the house, it wasn't dramatic or planned, it was just quiet. I packed a small bag with clothes, a few notebooks, my medication, and the stack of letters I had written. I placed them on the passenger seat of my car and started driving without a destination in mind. The early morning streets were nearly empty and the city still looked half asleep. I passed the bakery where Anna and I used to stop on Saturdays, the park where we used to walk after dinner, the coffee shop where I once surprised her on her birthday. Each place felt like a ghost town made of memories that no longer belonged to me. I ended up in a small coastal town a few hours north, a place I had visited years ago for work. There was a modest motel near the shore where the paint had begun to peel from the door frames, and the air smelled faintly of salt and old wood. The owner gave me a room facing the water, and I spent the rest of the day sitting on the balcony watching the tide roll in and out. The waves had a rhythm that felt almost like breathing, and for the first time in weeks I felt something close to calm. The next few days passed slowly in that quiet town. I woke with the sunrise, walked along the beach, collected shells I didn't need, and filled pages of my notebook with thoughts that made no sense even to me. I didn't check my phone except once a day when I saw messages from Anna asking where I was and when I'd be home. I didn't reply. It wasn't out of cruelty, but because I had nothing left to say. I needed distance to understand what was left of me beyond the diagnosis and the betrayal. It was on the fifth morning that something shifted. I woke before dawn and walked down to the water where the mist hung low and the air felt sharp and cool. A fisherman stood a few feet away, pulling his nets in silence, and when he nodded at me, I nodded back. It was a small gesture, but it reminded me that life went on for everyone else, that the world didn't stop turning because my own had cracked. I sat on a rock and watched the first light spread across the horizon, and for the first time I allowed myself to think about what dying really meant. Not in the dramatic sense of hospitals and monitors, but in the simple truth of vanishing quietly from a life that would continue without me. By mid-morning, I found myself sitting in a small cafe near the dock sipping coffee that tasted bitter and strong. The waitress was kind and asked if I was visiting or staying for a while. I told her I wasn't sure yet. She smiled and said most people who came here said the same thing. There was something comforting about that idea that maybe we were all just passing through, waiting to figure out where we belonged. Later that day, I finally checked my phone again and saw a message from an unfamiliar number. It was from the man Anna had been seeing. He had written that he thought I deserved to know that Anna had decided to end things with him and that she had told him she was pregnant but unsure if she would keep the baby. He said he was sorry for everything and that he hoped I could forgive her one day. Reading those words felt like a twist of something deep in my chest, but not anger, not jealousy, just a weary sort of understanding. I had been preparing myself for death while she had been preparing herself for a life she no longer wanted. In a strange way, we had both been drifting toward endings neither of us could avoid. That night, I sat on the balcony again, listening to the waves and thinking about how life has a cruel sense of timing. If I had told Anna about my cancer before her confession, maybe she would have stayed out of guilt, maybe she would have never confessed at all, and I would have gone to my grave believing our marriage was intact. But now I saw the truth laid bare, and somehow that honesty felt like a strange gift. I had been spared the illusion of comfort that would have made the end even harder. The betrayal hurt, but it also freed me from pretending that everything had meaning simply because it once did. The following morning I went for another walk along the beach, and as I watched the gulls circle above the water I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad in the same way I had been before. What I felt was something quieter, a kind of acceptance that came from finally seeing the whole picture. Anna wasn't a villain, just a person who made choices out of fear and confusion, much like I had spent years avoiding the hard truths about our life together. We had both been running from reality, though in different directions. When I returned to the motel, I opened my notebook and wrote another entry. I wrote that sometimes the worst things strip us bare enough to finally see ourselves clearly. I wrote that love doesn't end neatly, that it fades unevenly like the tide, leaving behind small traces of what it once carried. And then I wrote that I was ready to go home. That evening I packed my bag and watched the sun set over the water for what I knew would be the last time. The colors bled together in a way that looked almost deliberate, as if the sky itself was trying to paint closure. I felt lighter as I drove away from the coast, though I didn't know what waited for me back home. All I knew was that the silence inside me had changed. It no longer felt like emptiness, but like space being made for something new, even if I wouldn't live long enough to see what that might be. When I finally pulled into our driveway hours later, the house was dark except for one light glowing faintly in the kitchen. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the doorknob, knowing that whatever came next would not be about forgiveness or blame. It would simply be about truth. Because if the diagnosis had taught me anything, it was that time is too fragile for pretending. And with that thought, I opened the door and stepped inside. The house felt still when I stepped inside, as if it had been holding its breath while I was gone. The faint scent of laundry detergent and the cool quiet of the hallway made it feel both familiar and foreign, like walking through a photograph of a place I used to live. I placed my bag by the door and listened for any sign of movement upstairs, but there was none. The kitchen light was the only one on, and beside the sink I found a small stack of unopened mail, and a note in Anna's handwriting saying she had gone to her sister's for a few days, and that we could talk when I was ready. The sight of it brought no relief, just a strange heaviness that settled in my chest. I had driven home thinking I would face her, that I would finally speak the truth aloud, but instead the house greeted me with silence. I spent that first night back, sitting on the couch in the living room with the lights off, listening to the quiet tick of the wall clock. The stillness gave me too much room to think. I thought about how easily the ordinary things remained untouched by catastrophe, how the furniture, the framed photographs, the half-read books on the shelf all continued to exist unchanged, while the people who lived among them came undone. Somewhere in another life, this same room might have held laughter or arguments about grocery lists or late-night talks about our future. Now it was only a museum of what had been. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds in narrow bands that cut across the floor, and I decided it was time to do what I had been avoiding. I picked up the phone and called my doctor. I told him I wanted to begin treatment, not because I believed it would save me, but because I wasn't ready to stop trying. He explained the options, his voice calm and careful, and I wrote down every word, even though I already knew most of them by heart. When we hung up, I sat for a long time looking at the list. Chemotherapy, radiation, palliative care, each word a reminder of the narrowing road ahead. Later that day, I went to the backyard and sat on the old wooden bench beneath the oak tree. The air smelled faintly of rain and soil, and I could hear a distant lawnmower humming somewhere in the neighborhood. It was one of those moments when the world looks ordinary even while it is quietly breaking. I thought about Anna again, about how I had planned to share this burden with her, to face it together, and how that plan had dissolved before it could even begin. Strangely, though, I didn't feel bitter. I realized that maybe this solitude was what I needed now, a kind of clarity that comes only when there is no one left to perform for. That evening she called. Her name flashed on the screen, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, but something inside me urged me to answer. Her voice was soft, careful, almost as if she were afraid of disturbing a fragile silence. She said she had been thinking about everything and that she understood if I never wanted to see her again, but she needed to talk face to face. I told her to come over the next day. The decision surprised even me, but there was a part of me that wanted closure more than peace. The following afternoon she arrived wearing one of my old sweaters, the one she used to steal when she was cold. Her face looked pale, her eyes tired, but when she smiled weakly it was still the same smile I had fallen for years ago. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same place where both of our confessions had once shattered our life. She began to speak slowly, explaining that she had ended things completely with the other man, that she had told him she wanted nothing more to do with him. She said she had gone to her sister's because she needed to think about what she truly wanted, and that she now realized how deeply she had lost herself. I listened quietly, letting her words settle between us. When she said she was pregnant, her voice broke. She told me she had decided not to continue the pregnancy because she couldn't bring a child into a situation built on pain and betrayal. She said she knew that decision would make me think even less of her, but I didn't respond because there was nothing to say. My heart ached not from judgment but from the sheer sadness of how far we had both fallen. Finally, I told her the truth. I told her about the diagnosis, about the appointments and the scans and the months I had left. For a moment she didn't react at all, her expression frozen in disbelief. Then she started shaking her head, repeating that it couldn't be true, that I must have misunderstood the doctors. When I handed her the papers from the hospital, she covered her mouth and began to cry, the kind of deep cry that comes from somewhere beneath words. She kept saying she was sorry, that if she had known she never would have hurt me, that she would have been there for every moment. I let her cry, and when she reached for my hand, I didn't pull away this time. We sat like that for a long while without speaking. The light from the window faded and shadows stretched across the table. At some point she whispered that she wanted to take care of me now, that she needed to. I told her she didn't owe me that, and that staying out of guilt would only make things harder for both of us. She said it wasn't guilt, that she wanted to make things right even if it was too late. I didn't answer because I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. That night she stayed in the guest room while I lay awake in our bed staring at the ceiling. I could hear her footsteps faintly through the wall, the restless pacing of someone who couldn't find peace. I thought about how strange it was that the truth had finally brought us closer again, though in a way neither of us wanted. I knew she was sincere in her remorse, but sincerity couldn't rewrite what was already written. I had found a kind of quiet acceptance in solitude, and now her presence stirred feelings I wasn't ready to name. Before I finally drifted off to sleep, I wrote another line in my notebook. I wrote that sometimes forgiveness isn't about the other person, it's about lightening the weight you carry so it doesn't crush you before time does. When I put the pen down, I realized that, for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid of dying. What frightened me now was living long enough to see her regret turn into something I couldn't bear to witness. And as I closed my eyes, I wondered if mercy sometimes meant walking away even when the heart begged you to stay. The following morning sunlight poured through the blinds and filled the room with that pale golden light that makes everything look softer than it really is. I lay still for a while, listening to the faint sound of water running in the kitchen where Anna was moving quietly, as if she didn't want to wake me. When I finally got up and walked down the hall, I found her standing by the sink pouring coffee into 2 mugs the same way she used to before the distance between us began. For a brief moment it felt like the old rhythm of our mornings had returned, but the illusion vanished when she turned and her eyes met mine. There was too much history there now, too much that couldn't be erased. We sat at the table together, sipping our coffee in silence. She asked how I was feeling, and I told her the truth, that I didn't really know. My body felt weaker, but my mind had reached a strange calm, as if it had accepted the balance between what could still be fixed and what never would be. She told me she wanted to go with me to my next doctor's appointment, that she wanted to be there through whatever came next. I nodded, but inside I wasn't sure if I wanted that. Part of me wanted her near because the idea of facing everything alone felt heavy, but another part of me knew that I didn't want my last days to be spent reliving our broken story through her guilt. Later that day, I went to the hospital for a round of tests. The nurse spoke gently, the way people do when they sense you already know too much. The hallway smelled of antiseptic, and the hum of machines followed me from room to room. Every face I passed carried some quiet version of the same pain I felt, though expressed differently, some through numbness, some through forced cheer. I realized then that dying isn't the hardest part, it's watching how everyone else learns to keep living around you. When I returned home, Anna had tidied the entire house. The floors gleamed, the laundry was folded, and dinner was simmering on the stove. It felt strange to see her trying to build order out of chaos, as if she could scrub away everything that had happened. She told me she had taken time off work, that she wanted to focus on me for a while. I thanked her but didn't ask her to stay longer than she wanted. The truth was, I didn't want to become a project she needed to complete to prove something to herself. In the days that followed, a new rhythm settled into place. She would wake early, make breakfast, and check on me throughout the day, while I spent most of my time writing in the notebook that had become the only place where I could speak freely. Sometimes she would sit beside me reading quietly, other times she would try to start small conversations about movies or the garden or the weather, anything that didn't touch the heavy things between us. It was strange how comfort could exist even inside so much ruin. One evening, as we sat on the porch, the air warm, and still, she told me that she had been to see the man she had once loved. She said she wanted to tell me because I deserved honesty. She had told him everything about my illness and that she couldn't see him again, that she needed to stay here. He had apparently said he understood and wished her well. I asked her why she felt the need to tell him about me, and she said because she needed him to understand why she was choosing to stay. Her voice broke when she said it wasn't out of pity, but because she couldn't bear to leave me alone in this state. I didn't respond right away because I could feel both the sincerity and the sadness in her words. She wanted redemption and I wanted peace, and sometimes those two things simply couldn't exist in the same place. Later that night, when she had gone to bed, I stepped outside again. The sky was wide and full of stars, and the air smelled faintly of summer grass. I sat on the steps and thought about how strange it was that pain and beauty could exist side by side like that. I realized that the past weeks had forced me to see time differently, not as something to race through, but as something to observe carefully, piece by piece. I found myself grateful even for the ache, because it meant I was still alive enough to feel. The next morning I woke early and found Anna still asleep, curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Her phone lay on the floor beside her screen, glowing faintly. Out of instinct more than curiosity, I picked it up and saw a message from her sister asking how things were going. The message above it caught my eye. It was from her doctor, a confirmation about an appointment for a prenatal follow-up. My heart clenched. She had told me she ended the pregnancy, but the message suggested otherwise. I set the phone back down quietly and sat beside her, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. For a while I tried to convince myself that it could be a mistake, an old reminder she hadn't canceled yet, but deep down I knew. The truth pressed against me like a weight. She had chosen to keep the baby, but had hidden it from me, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of confusion. I wasn't even sure whose child it was, but at that moment it didn't matter. The realization didn't bring anger, only a deep, weary sadness. She had lied again, though this time I couldn't even blame her. Maybe she thought protecting me from that truth was a kindness. When she woke later that morning, I told her I was going for a drive to clear my head. She looked at me for a long moment, as if she sensed something had shifted, but she didn't ask what. I drove aimlessly through town, the streets blurring past, until I reached the park by the river where we had once spent so many afternoons. I sat on a bench and watched the water move slowly beneath the bridge. The reflection of the sky rippled across the surface, and for a moment I imagined that it was possible to start over, to wash everything clean. I pulled my notebook from my jacket pocket and began writing again. I wrote that truth is never as pure as we wish it to be, and that people lie sometimes not to deceive but to protect the fragile balance between love and despair. I wrote that I understood now that forgiveness doesn't always come as a grand gesture, but sometimes as the simple act of choosing not to break what little piece remains. Then I closed the notebook and sat still, listening to the soft murmur of the river until the light began to fade. By the time I drove home, the sky had turned a deep shade of blue and I could see the first stars appearing. I didn't know what I would say to her or if I would even mention what I had seen. All I knew was that the truth had taken so much from both of us already, and maybe the kindest thing I could do now was let her keep whatever small illusion gave her hope. Because at this point hope was all either of us had left to hold on to. The days that followed slipped by quietly, like water running through my hands. I stopped marking time by the calendar and instead by smaller things like how long it took for the kettle to whistle or how the afternoon light changed as autumn began to edge closer. Anna stayed at the house, though we spoke little. The air between us had turned soft and careful, like a space two people keep around a wound that has not healed but no longer bleeds. She seemed calmer than before, moving through the rooms with a kind of gentle purpose, cooking small meals, folding laundry, humming sometimes under her breath. I could tell she thought she was helping by keeping life steady, and in a way she was. Even silence can be a form of kindness when words do more harm than good. I still had not told her that I knew about the message on her phone. I carried that knowledge quietly, the way people carry photographs of things they cannot look at too often. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, it was more like surrender. She had her truth and I had mine, and there was no point forcing them to collide anymore. The treatments had begun to wear me down faster than I expected. My body felt heavy in the mornings, and the mirror showed a face that belonged more to memory than to life. Yet some days I still managed to sit in the garden with a cup of tea and feel something close to peace when the sun touched my face. One evening near the end of September, I asked Anna to drive me to the coast. The trip was only a few hours, and she agreed without question. We left early in the morning, and the drive passed mostly in silence. The sea appeared on the horizon just before noon, stretching wide and bright under the pale sky. The same small town where I had stayed alone weeks earlier looked unchanged, the same weathered houses, the same boats rocking gently in the water. We found a spot near the rocks and sat watching the waves break against the shore. The air was cool and carried the faint taste of salt. After a long while she spoke. She told me she had kept the baby. Her voice trembled when she said she knew it was wrong to lie, but that she could not bring herself to end another life while she was already watching mine fade. She said she didn't expect me to understand, and that she didn't even know what she would do when the time came, but that she wanted to tell the truth before it was too late. I listened without interruption, feeling the wind brush against my face, and the words settle somewhere deep where anger could no longer reach. I told her I already knew. Her eyes widened and she started to cry quietly, but I reached over and took her hand. I told her I wasn't angry, that people make impossible choices when they are scared, and that maybe this child was the only piece of light either of us would leave behind. We sat together for a long time after that, with the waves murmuring below us. The tide moved in and out, steady and certain, like something eternal. I thought about how small our stories really are against the scale of the sea, and how little control we have over what remains of us once we are gone. There was a strange comfort in that thought. When we drove back home, the sun was low and the road shimmered with heat. I felt tired but lighter somehow. That night after Anna fell asleep, I opened my notebook for the last time. The pages were filled now with uneven handwriting, notes, thoughts, small fragments of a life trying to make sense of itself. I wrote one final entry. I wrote that love is not measured by how it ends, but by how much truth it can carry without breaking. I wrote that I had learned forgiveness is not a single act but a quiet decision repeated each day until the heart remembers how to breathe again. The next morning I called my sister and told her about the baby. I asked her to look after Anna when I was gone to make sure she was not alone. My sister agreed, her voice thick with emotion, and I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known in months. Later that day I gave Anna the box of letters I had written and told her she could read them whenever she was ready. She asked if she could stay beside me, and I said yes. As the weeks passed, the house grew quieter but not empty. We spent more time on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the light fade earlier each evening. Sometimes she would talk about the baby, and sometimes she would just sit with her hand resting lightly over mine. There was nothing grand or cinematic about those final days, no dramatic farewell, no perfect resolution. There was only the simple rhythm of two people who had broken each other, learning how to exist in the same silence without bitterness. When the end finally came, it was gentle. I remember the sound of rain on the roof and the scent of tea in the air. I remember her voice, soft and steady, telling me to rest. In those last moments my thoughts drifted to the sea, the sound of the waves, the feel of the wind, and that fleeting sense of peace that had found me at the water's edge. I wasn't afraid. I thought of the child she would bring into the world and hoped that somehow through that small new life something good might grow out of everything we had lost. If there is any truth that death teaches, it is that love, even when it fails, still leaves warmth behind. And as I took one final breath, that was the only thing that mattered.